Today's topic is foodways, the last large issue that we're going to cover in this course. What is foodways? Well, it refers to more than just food. Foodways is a recognition that food is stored, prepared, eaten, and discarded following social rules. Thus, foodways refers to food in a social and cultural setting. Archaeologists find lots of evidence for food. We find evidence for food storage, such as underground pits, above-ground corn cribs, large ceramic vessels, even rice rat bones. We find evidence for the preparation of food, such as where it's prepared and how it's cooked. We find evidence for what people ate, both plant and animal remains, what cuts of meat, what ratios of foods, what isotopic evidence in human bone can tell us about human diet. We find evidence for feasting, or how food is properly presented or served. We find evidence for the discard of food remains. Where is it disposed of? What is disposed of? Let's think about our society for a moment. Does everyone eat the same food? How about men versus women? Pregnant or nursing women, don't we have some specific ideas about foods that they should or should not eat? Infants versus toddlers. How about adolescents? Adults? Old people? I believe our society has some very definite ideas about appropriate foods for each of these. Rich versus poor. What about foods that mark cultural identity? Food for sick people, food for health, food for religious observance. When would a person from South Carolina always eat this particular meal? Well, if you're from South Carolina, you'll recognize this as the meal that you eat on New Year's Day: Hoppin' John, collard greens, and sweet potatoes. An archaeologist examines containers, as well as where things happened and what is associated with what else. For example, here is a modern-day container. Perhaps you recognize it. Today, is it socially okay to serve soup in this container? Or can you serve soup in this container? Both of these would make excellent soup containers. Are these appropriate serving containers and utensils for a formal reception with dignitaries visiting from another country? Examination of foodways by archaeologists in North America more or less began with Southeastern archaeologists looking at complex social situations among Mississippians. But now we have a few studies in the Southwest where societies appear to have been egalitarian, but we're not quite sure how those societies worked, and a growing number of studies around the world and in other places in the U.S. Logically, all social groups have social rules, so foodways should be of interest even when society was not a ranked Mississippian period type society. In other words, food is socially constructed. Foodways are not just a passive reflection of society. People integrate food into social negotiation and action. Food has social, political, and symbolic import. The distribution and consumption of food is a socially and politically meaningful act. The meaning of food can change depending on context, on how food is acquired, who prepares it, the context of its consumption, and so on. Johannessen looked at community layout, storage, vessels, and plant foods to see what linkages existed between changes in food or diet and changes in social practices in the American bottom for a 600-year period during the Late Woodland to the early Mississippian. These are the data we reviewed already when I talked about the American bottom changes through time during the transition from the egalitarian Late Woodland through the emergent Mississippian to the ranked societies of the Mississippian period. What we saw was that social change is not always reflected in dietary change. That people could continue eating the same foods But we did see a change in how people viewed themselves and the world, going from individual households to solidarity of a village to affiliation with a mound center. As social and religious boundaries expanded, so too did elaboration of the social and food codes. The cooking and serving of foods became more complicated. One area of archaeological interest is feasting. Feasting can be defined as any sharing between two or more people of special foods in a meal for a special purpose or occasion. Feasts can have practical benefits to mobilize labor or create cooperative relationships between groups, or even to exclude different groups, to invest surpluses and generate profits, to attract desirable items such as mates or allies by advertising the success of the group, to create political power by reciprocal debt, to extract surplus for elite use, to solicit favors, to compensate for transgressions. The main reason for most feasts is to create or maintain important social relationships. We can find a number of archaeological signatures of feasts. The food itself may be rare or labor-intensive, or it might be special recreational food. The quantity of food items might tell us that this might be a feast, or the evidence of wasted food items. The preparation vessels might be of unusual types or unusually large sizes or in unusual numbers. The serving vessels might also be of unusual quality or materials, unusual sizes, unusual numbers, or a higher ratio of serving to preparation vessels. We might see an unusual size of food preparation facilities, such as large roasting pits, or an unusual number of facilities, or an unusual location or construction of facilities. The feasting facilities might also include special structures for large numbers or for the elite, for example, or special display facilities such as scaffolds or poles, or scaffolds placed on top of mounds. So also special locations. Are they in a mortuary location or a remote location that are clearly not habitation sites where you'd expect to be eating? Are these loci associated with nuclear households? Are they associated with residential corporate households, or large feasting middens, or central community spaces? What about disposing of the food? Do we find bone dumps or feasting middens? Do we find special refuse fires containing feasting items, or ritualized location of disposal, such as on the east side of a mound? Do we find associated prestige goods? How abundant are they? Do we find that they are deliberately being destroyed? Do we find ritualized items of etiquette, such as smoking or other narcotic paraphernalia, or ritualized vessels? One or two ritual vessels are associated with drinking black drink, taken to purify before an important ritual. Here we have an etching from Lemoyne showing women cooking a tea from the leaves of a holly and men drinking it out of whelk shell cups. Yaupon holly is the only caffeine-bearing plant in North America. Its scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, was taken from this historic use of the plant. Archaeologists have more recently found that these beakers from Cahokia had contained black drink and left behind traces of caffeine. Do we find record-keeping devices or not, or tally markers? Sometimes there are pictorial and written records of feasts. And we may also find food storage facilities. Are these in a public storage in a public area, such as a corn crib? Feasting was often tied to platform mound ceremonialism. Now, mound building in the Southeast has long been done as a ritual associated with world renewal. We may be able to trace it back as far as the oldest mounds that we have in the Southeast, dating to the Middle Archaic. Platform mound building extends back to the Middle Woodland in the southeast. However, the summits of Middle Woodland platform mounds appear to have had very different uses than the summits of Mississippian platform mounds. Middle Woodland platform mound summits are covered with large posts that were inserted but then removed, as well as hearths, small pits, and midden. The post holes intruded into each other, which indicates that old posts had been removed and that the surface was repeatedly used for a long period of time. The post holes appear to have been for erecting scaffolds, racks, and isolated poles, perhaps for displaying prestige goods and feasting connected items. We find also evidence for food preparation and consumption. We find exotic or not local raw materials and special use pottery. Middle Woodland platform mounds are located at villages, and access does not seem to be restricted to these mounds. James Knight hypothesizes that Middle Woodland platform mounds were communal, integrative facilities that involved repetitive, patterned combination of behaviors associated with feasting. Repetitive, patterned combination of behaviors. Rituals. We find manipulation of exotic artifacts, caching of goods in small pits, food preparation and consumption, frequent scaffolding of objects, monumental display of poles, and earthen stages periodically renewed. The use of Mississippian platform mounds is not communal, but rather reinforced social differences. One example can be seen of feasting at Cahokia. A large borrow pit was found off the northeastern edge of the Grand Plaza. This borrow pit had been quickly filled with debris from feasting. And when I say large, I mean large. This pit, known as Sub-mound 51, was at least 53 meters long. That's over half the length of a football field, by 20 meters wide and 3 meters deep. It was filled very rapidly and then covered with the mound, and thus even uncharred organic remains were preserved in this pit. Analysis of Zone D2 dates it to the Loman phase, AD 1000 to 1050, which is the same period as the elite burial with sacrifices in Mound 72, located to the south of the Grand Plaza. In the pit, they find craft goods and exotic materials, sumptuary items such as crystals, exotic, not local arrowheads, axe head debitage, engraved and painted vessels, drilled alligator tooth, bone harpoon, marine shell beads, and spoons. The faunal remains are highly unusual because deer constitute almost 100% of the mammal remains. And many of the deer bones are whole, not fragmented, and many are articulated. This chart shows you in white the number of bones that a living deer would have. So a living deer has mostly low utility bones, many fewer mid-utility bones, and only a few bones associated with high utility meat. Whereas the bones found in the pit have mostly mid-utility and then high utility. So obviously the meat was butchered elsewhere and select bulk cuts of meat were brought back to Cahokia for this ritual. Meat was cut from the bones for boiling or drying. The bones were whole, therefore they were not processed for marrow, as was normal at households. The archaeologists found large numbers of blowfly and flesh-eating beetles, indicating that raw tissue remained attached to the bones when the bones were deposited in the pit. In the pit, they found a lower than normal variety of birds, but most of the birds they found are swan, which is unusual, and none of the remains included swan wings. The archaeologists interpret this to say that the wings were being used as fans. They also found a fair amount of prairie chickens, which otherwise are recovered from elite context in the Sterling phase. They found a lower than normal variety of fish, but the fish they found are the large river fish, mostly buffalo sucker and gar, whereas at households you normally find smaller backwater fish. They found very little maize, but a lot of maygrass, as is pictured here, and then other members of the Eastern agricultural complex. Another sure sign that this was a special context was finding both tobacco and leafy branches of Eastern red cedar. Archaeologists interpret Sub-mound 51 deposits as the remains from public ritual and feasting activities attended by all segments of the community. It was a huge pit, and it appears to contain debris from feasting preparation rather than debris left over from after the feast. It may have taken place in the late summer or early fall based on fresh remains such as masses of squash seeds scooped out, and that's also when swans would have been migrating through the area. Southeastern archaeologists also perform functional analyses of pottery assemblages to talk about foodways. At the Lubbock Creek site in western Alabama, near Moundville, a Mississippian single-mound town, Blitz analyzed pottery from the mound precinct versus the village. He hypothesized that he would find fancier pottery, different pottery, and larger pottery at the mound precinct to support the idea that at the mound precinct is where ritual display and feasting activities would take place. Instead, he found the same shapes of vessels, the same surface treatments, the same decorations, same ratio of serving to cooking wares. Uh-oh. But he did find that the range and size of vessels differed. He found the full range of sizes among the village vessels. So here, for example, you see the village jars all the way from small to large, the village bowls all the way from small to large. But he found only large vessels in the mound precinct. Thus, larger groups need the large end of the vessel range size. Other artifact distributions found at Lubbock Creek. They found stone tool flint knapping debris only in the village, but near the mounds they did find some high status items such as mica and stone paint pallets and lumps of mineral paints. They found several colorful birds only at the mound precinct, and choice cuts of deer meat in the mound precinct. And half the rat bones were found near the mounds. What do these indicate? They indicate that this is where grain was being stored. Archaeologists also looked at food and pottery remains from different types of sites in the Moundville chiefdom. They looked at scattered farmsteads, single-mound town, and Moundville itself, and within Moundville, different contexts. And they discovered that not all elite contexts are equal. They found differences in the food remains, in ratios of cooking to serving wares, and relative frequencies of vessel types. For example, food processing, distribution, and consumption varied by social status or by the settings in which food was consumed. They found most of the maize cob and nutshell fragments, the portions that you don't eat, at the farmsteads, indicating that the farmsteads were provisioning people at the mound towns. That is, people at the farmsteads were shelling maize and acorns and sending the food to town. Archaeologists found an increasing ratio of serving to cooking ware with increasing status of the context. However, the relative frequencies of serving ware shapes differ from one high status context to another. The fanciest flaring rim bowls were most common at the single mound center, not at Moundville. At the single mound center, the entire population took part in rituals. Whereas at Moundville itself, they found less show, because the pots they examined were from one of the mounds where just one clan held ceremonies, not the entire population. How can archaeologists identify high-status food? The elite have the ability to monopolize certain foodstuffs, especially if that food is a symbol of their position in society. Egalitarian societies have a strong ethic requiring the giving and sharing of food. Individuals will have access to the same sorts of foods, but you may find differences in quantities of foods in an egalitarian society. Any pattern differences in diet in egalitarian society are likely to relate to age, sex, clan, division of labor, achieved status, or a temporary status. In ranked societies, the following foods may be identified as restricted for elite consumption: scarce foods, or overly abundant foods, diverse foods, labor-intensive foods for acquiring or preparing the food, foods that occur only periodically, such as migrating animals or birds, exotic or not local, tasty, that is, protein-rich or fatty, salty, spicy, sweet, or symbolically potent, which of course would be the most difficult for an archaeologist to prove. So foodways, food in a social and cultural setting. If we understand that food is socially constructed, that it has social, political, and symbolic import, and that the distribution and consumption of food is a socially and politically meaningful act, then a foodways framework can be a powerful tool for learning about societies.